Sometimes I wonder if you can tell. I finished the episode on tears. Silly me. Silly me. A little bit of insight. I tend to think of things in advance. Not in detail, but in general. I would like to, for example, talk about certain episodes. I'm not going to give details, but like there are episodes of TNG, of Deep Space Nine, of Farscape, of Enterprise, of the original series, all of which, of Space and Beyond, that I've already had thoughts about, that I already have things I'd like to discuss. And I've kind of, been building up to this episode for a long time. In fact, this episode is what made me want to ruminate on Babylon 5. No joke. It's the one where I was like, there's really something to discuss there. And this episode also kind of informed the format we've been using for Babylon 5, which is just a little bit different from what we've been doing over on Voyager. Excuse me. The funny thing is, this episode, it might surprise you to learn that this is one of my favorite episodes of Babylon 5. It's among the top, whatever. That might surprise you because it's not really an arc episode. In fact, aside from one tiny little thing regarding Leda and a few little continuity nods here or there, this episode has nothing to do with anything. It's a bottle show about a guest star. And yet, it's very well done. It's Brad Dourif. I'll talk about him in a minute. And it's got a very, very powerful series of messages under it. This is an episode that basically takes several legitimate social issues that we are facing in real life, and have been since this episode came out, and just smashes you right across the face with it. And this is very important, it doesn't tell you what's right or wrong. It doesn't take a simplified version of it. It says, here's the situation, here's the circumstances. And then it sits back and lets you decide what you believe. It shows several viewpoints, and we see several viewpoints throughout this, thematically speaking. Kind of similar to our last episode with pragmatism versus idealism. But in that case, again, neither side was portrayed as the correct choice. So Brad Dourif, for those of you who don't know, he's the gentleman who plays Brother Edward and Charlie in this episode. He's actually been in a lot of random stuff over the years, a lot of geek stuff too. He's good. He's really good at what he does, which is very creepy, very evil, or both. And yet, the really interesting thing is, I've often found it's his unique take on things that makes him interesting. He knows how to portray creepy without disgusting, if that makes any sense. Eerie, it might actually be a better word for how he portrays his characters. Someone who portrays someone who's just slimy or disgusting is someone you just want to be shoved off the screen as quickly as possible. Again, I've talked about this time. There's a Type 3 villain who's a creep, and then there's a Type 3 villain who's a creep who you don't want to see anymore. Kefka may be an inhuman monster, but every time he's on the screen, it's like, yeah, more Kefka, as opposed to, I'm not going to name any specific characters, but, insert character B here, where it's like, oh, God, why do I have to see more of this guy? So Brad Dourif has always managed to add just that little flavor of, I guess charisma is the word here, to make it so that even when he is playing an eerie character, you don't want him off the screen, you want to see more. He did a great job of this as Suitor over on Voyager, actually, portraying someone who, while he had very serious issues and murdered people, there was something about him and his presentation that made him more than just, And he wasn't a slime ball or anything. He was someone who portrayed, he was just off. Now, all of this is important because in this episode, he portrays none of that. He hardly plays Charlie, the guy who would fit that mold, at all. He plays Edward in this episode, and he does an astonishingly good job of playing this kindly, brotherly, helpful, monk, a Type 3 religious character. I just realized this is the first time this has come up. This will probably come up in the future in Babylon 5. In fact, I know it will. I just thought of an episode. And The Rock cried out, no hiding place. We'll be talking about this again. 3 types of religion. Okay, so what I mean by this, I'm not applying this to real life. Let's make that clear. Please don't put words in my mouth. Okay? Tired of it. I've had several people do it already. In fiction, usually, religious people are portrayed in one of 3 manners. The first here, I shouldn't do that. I don't want to accidentally flip you guys up. The first here is hypocritical and evil. I mean, that's those two things hand in hand. Someone who is the villain and usually is basically just using religion as a way to advance their own career. Kai Wynn over on DS9 is a great example of this type of religious character. Type 2 is the person who is obstinate and obstructive. Someone who isn't exactly a villain in the typical sense of the word, but someone who is in the way of good things happening. You know, basically the bureaucrat. And type 3, this type here, is how Brad Dourif plays it in this episode. Someone who is basically a practicer of what they preach, is how I would best put that. Someone who is kindly, positive, you know, tries to help people, and isn't very overt about it. You don't see Edward trying to force other people to believe things he believes. You don't see him being hypocritical and doing things he doesn't believe in. You don't see him as a villain. You don't see him getting in the way of progress. He's basically just a kindly old monk kind of a thing. And it's funny because that's actually kind of one of the more rare presentations in fiction. But I bring this up because Brad Dourif does a surprisingly good job of that Type 3. You'd think he'd be a perfect fit for the first two, especially the first one, the kind of villain. But no, he portrays this nice, kind guy who just wants to help other people. You really see this in his discussions with Delenn and Lanier. He is listening to an alien race discuss another religion. And yet there's no blasphemer. There's no, oh, well, I don't think that's right. Or there's not even subtle about how disapproval or judgmental. He just comes across as interested. I want to learn more about what you believe. I want to learn more about how you feel about this. There's sort of an openness about him, which makes him very warm and very, it makes people comfortable around him. And I'm amazed Brad Dourif pulls that off. He does a great job of it. I was going to have this whole speech about the chess game. I've decided not to. It's not that relevant. We'll just move on from the chess game. I like the idea of a religious order selling precision services, I make that point, as a way of funding their missionary work, because it's surprisingly logical. Any religious order that has a brain understands that in a pre-scarcity society, aka virtually every society that has ever existed, in fiction and in fact, knows you need currency, you need supplies, you need some kind of backing to keep functioning. So there's lots of ways to do that. And again, I'm trying, please, it's going to be impossible to discuss this without getting into things that are going to be hot button topics. I'm sorry, but some religious groups, we're going to stick with fiction here, by the way. In fiction, some religious groups will go out of the way to extort money, you know, pay to be redeemed of your sins. Breath of Fire has done this, actually, for an example. You know, you must pay to the Church of St. Eva in order to be redeemed of your sins, that kind of a thing. Some organizations will do things where they accept donations. The Order, in my own Primus campaign, while not actually a religious organization, functions on that way. People willingly donate money to the Order, and they are actually quite wealthy as a result of that, and can spend money on the various things that they do. But the idea of we are religious individuals, or I shouldn't say religious, that's really the wrong word. We are people who have a spiritual faith, a spiritual belief, and we are very precise in it. We are very meticulous in it. That is a skill. That level of precision, that level of meticulous art is a skill which is something that can be marketed. And I like the way Dourif tries to sell the woman on that. It's actually a nice touch. And the idea that certain corporations would value that and be willing to pay for that makes perfect sense. It's astonishingly logical, which is why I'm so weirded out. Please feel free to correct me on this, but I'm having trouble coming up with another example of another organization of a spiritual basis that does something like that in the rest of fiction. I'm sure there is one, I just can't think of one right now. Let's talk about Leda really quick. We're just going to kind of run through Leda, because she really has a small impact on the episode, aside from a couple things. Nice point, though, that the Leda plot and the Brother Edward plot do connect. It's a thing I've mentioned before, that Babylon 5 does very well. You have your A plot, you have your B plot, and they should weave at least once or twice, so that the two plots have some significance to each other, either thematically or literally. In this case, literally. Leda's presence enables them an act that they couldn't otherwise do. Now, they weren't in time to save Brother Edward, which sucks horribly, but at least it's an aspect of that. Of course, saving Brother Edward was never the point, was it? But I'll get to that. So is Leda superhuman? Or is she just a human at the peak of her existence? Now, of course, she's got the Gil things that we see, and there's the interaction with Kosh, which brings me to an interesting question. How much do you think Leda's dislike of Londo is because She, regardless of any external influences, just dislikes Londo. She's probably heard about what's been happening lately, and the Centauri especially. Or do you think she was, without meaning to, picking up some of his thoughts, therefore, being able to have a negative opinion of him? Or do you think the Vorlons warned her about him? At this point, we can pretty definitively say, without any spoilers, that Londo has been working with the Shadows. He didn't know that, but he was. Now, he has tried to sever his connection to the Shadows, so that's something, but I don't think the Vorlons would look too kindly on his association regardless. They don't really seem the forgiving type, ironically, given the episode. Also, why do you think they took an interest in Leda? Or did Kosh specifically take an interest in Leda? Moving on. Londo's interactions with her are fascinating. It's a very small character piece, but it does show kind of the direction Londo's going in. We of course, already did a big thing on this in the previous episode, but just in quick, look how he reacts. First, he tries casual conversation, which is free and cheap and easy. That doesn't work. So he tries to be charming. I'm your friend. I'm on your side. All a lie, of course. Then he tries to bribe her. I will pay for what I want. Then he tries to threaten her. It's an interesting progression and makes perfect sense for where Londo is right now. He would rather just in casual conversation learn about the Vorlons. No? Okay, well maybe we could talk it over dinner. Maybe we could discuss that. No? I'm willing to pay you for information on the Vorlons. No? I'm willing to hurt you if you don't give me information on the Vorlons. It's interesting because it shows also not only how far Londo's willing to go for what he perceives as valuable, but also for the fact that he would rather get it the easy way, but is willing to get it the hard way. It's an interesting in-between there. I think that's all I have to talk about, except for the big theme, which I think I'll save for next. So let's talk about Edward really quick. Edward's story about Gethsemane is interesting because on first glance it's a religious story. But if you really analyze it the second viewing, I actually rewatched this episode a couple times before doing this, it's not religious. It's all about, are you willing to have the courage to go through something horrible because it is necessary? That is the tone and thrust of the conversation and its significance to the episode and its significance to the entire series. This is foreshadowing in its most blatant form. This is showcasing that in order to have what is necessary happen, it will be painful, it will be brutal, and it will be harsh. The story about what Christ went through at Gethsemane then is highlighted by what actually happens to Edward in this episode. And both of these not only inform his character, his wondering, how could you do that? How could you sit there and wait knowing what's coming? And his own rising up to the occasion, having the courage to do so, is exactly what the B5 crew has been doing and will have to continue doing in the future. Every one of them will have to have the courage to pass through the flame. That's a phrase I use. When you have to do something that you don't want to do, and it's horrible and it's unpleasant, but you have to do it if you want to keep going forward, you have to pass through the flame. It's a term I came up with a long time ago that I've used a few times in my real life. I don't like passing through the flame. I really don't. It's very horrible. Just thinking about it is actually making me shake a little bit. But that's a question you can't really, in my experience, answer until you're in the moment. Just like Edward did. He didn't know if he had the courage to pass through the flame until he was standing in front of it. And all the group came in. And the one guy walks forward and says, you needed to know what you're suffering. You needed to know, and blah, blah, blah. And then it's interesting to me that Edward considered this a requirement. Now, there is no doubt in my mind that he did so because of his beliefs, that he believed that some kind of justice, or actually revenge, was necessary in order to balance the scales for what Charlie did. He makes his statements clear. It is his soul, it is his person. Just because I don't remember it, just because I am not that person anymore, does not mean that I did not do those things. And I am ready to suffer for my crimes. In truth, taking a completely neutral perspective, removing belief from the equation, there was no need for him to do that. And I can say that definitively and without opinion. I can say that as fact. You know why? Because Edward is not Charlie. The episode goes out of its way many times to demonstrate this fact. Even with memories restored, even with the knowledge in him, Edward is not a horrible person. He does not revert. He does not become some kind of criminal mastermind. He doesn't go insane. He's still Edward. He is disturbed by those memories. He is horrified by what he has seen. They are traumatizing to him. You remember the episode Memorial over in Voyager? One of the points I made clearly in that episode, and the episode itself did a good job of emphasizing, was that the crew of Voyager was absolutely horrified at these memories of what they did. Now, in that case, it was a fake memory. It was something that was being imposed upon them. But the whole point was that they were the kind of people that would never do something like that, would never butcher innocents, would never slaughter other people, would never be part of a massacre like that. They would never take part in that kind of thing. That is so contrary to who they are. That was fake. Edward knows that Charlie actually did those disgusting, horrible things, and he is mortified. But he's still Edward. He is still the new person. 8 years! I bothered to write it down. It's right there. He has been Edward for 8 years. Now, we don't know 100% how the new personality works, how the mind wipe works. We don't know the specifics to really be able to debate this in absolute minutia, but what we do know is droid effect. It's funny to me, when I first coined the term droid effect, I didn't realize how many different aspects of fiction it would apply to. For those of you who have not heard me say it before, droid effect is when something of sufficient intelligence is allowed to experience enough things to become and grow into a sentient sapient life. Named after droids in Star Wars, who are regularly memory wiped to prevent that from happening. We could argue back and forth as to whether Edward was a new person 8 years ago, but 8 years have passed. He has had 8 years of experience, of life, of interactions with others, of all those things that help to form the pattern that an individual is. He is definitively Edward, not Charlie. And when shown the crimes and horribleness of Charlie, even in a personal level, he remains Edward. Thus, it was not necessary for him to go through this, because Charlie doesn't exist anymore. Make sense? Now, it's understandable why some people wouldn't feel that way, in lore. Hell, even out of lore, really. Some people, Mr. Edward himself pulls up the thing. It's still my soul. My soul is still stained with blood. There's an interesting counter-argument to that. If you believe in a concept such as a soul, and forgiveness, and a higher power, that higher power knows what you did even if you don't. Wouldn't he or she or it or they be capable of forgiving you if you sincerely ask for it? Ignorance in and of itself is not a crime. I also... I guess it's time. We're skirting the edge here. We're really skirting the edge. Let's talk about a couple of things really quick. The episode covers the whole cycle of hatred thing very well. Let's talk about... Let's just bring the box down. Let's just go ahead and bring the controversy box down. Let's talk about this. So there's several perspectives given throughout the episode regarding this topic. Delenn, Garibaldi, Sheridan, Theo, and Edward all give a different... Oh, and the guy who becomes Malcolm. I forget his original name. All of them give a different perspective on justice, revenge, and vengeance. I'm going to save my big topic about those three things for later. What I want to talk about is the perspectives thing. Because Garibaldi... Well, actually, maybe I shouldn't. Let's talk about the cycle of hatred before we get into that. The cycle of hatred is easy to understand. It's so easy to understand. Your father killed some other guy's mother. Just bear with me. So that guy comes after you. So your son goes after him. So his son goes after your son. It's one of the easiest things to explain. Cycles of hatred are one of the most common things in real freaking life. Never mind in fiction. And we saw the cycle in this episode, and the idea of the cycle is presented several times. But it is worthy of note that one of the things that Theo goes out of his way to do is, even with knowledge, no ignorance this time, because he didn't know about Charlie, remember? He didn't know about Edward's past and about him being a new personality. But he knew about Malcolm, didn't he? He specifically requested him. How difficult is it to forgive? He'd made a deliberate choice to say, I'm not going to cling to this cycle. This particular thread of the cycle of hatred had been broken by his actions there. Now I know what you're saying. He was memory wiped. It's a new person. Yeah, that doesn't change anything about the cycle of hatred, does it? Because you didn't kill that guy's mother. Your dad did. But you're the one who's targeted. It's so easy to understand when you put it in those simple terms, because I've heard some people say this episode cheats, but it doesn't cheat. It would actually be cheating if it was somehow the same guy. Instead, it's this new personality, Malcolm, different personality, different memories, that has been programmed for this new end, right? In the same manner that cycles of hatred usually continue. It can't always be the same person. That wouldn't be a cycle then. It would be a one-off, just done. But no. It goes to children, it goes to members of the same faction, it goes to members of the same gender, it goes to members of the same age group, it goes to members of the people who look similar. Species, concepts, political factions. It doesn't matter that it's not the same person that originally perpetrated the crime. The whole point of the cycle of hatred is that you hate, but you can't attack or hurt the target of that hate. So you go someone adjacent to them, next to them, a new personality programmed from the original. You can hate that person, just like the people in this episode hated Edward for the crimes of Charlie. Even though, as I made so much of a point clear, Edward, not Charlie. That's the cycle of hatred. So the fact that Theo is willing to reach out the hand to Malcolm shows that at least this one thread of the cycle has been broken, and that he's not willing to let it continue. It's funny, too, because we could see the beginning of the next cycle in Sheridan. Sheridan wanted to slug the guy when he was talking to him, the original guy, not Malcolm. And when Malcolm approaches him and tries to reach his hand, Sheridan is visibly taken aback, actually withdraws from it in disgust. It's so easy to see how that cycle can continue, even though it's completely illogical. Alright, I don't actually need my notes for the rest of this. Oh! I don't know how long I'm going to be talking. This is the big topic, and the one that I've been preparing for the better part of 2 years. There's two topics here, actually. One is justice, and the other is the death of personality. Let's talk about justice first. As always, I like to define the way I use words so that you know what I'm talking about. I'm not trying to say this is the hardcore definition, but this is how I define them, this is how I use them in my real life, and this is how I'm using them in whatever I'm about to say in this show. So, remember I said justice, revenge, vengeance, okay? An arc. Justice is a balancing the scales in a positive manner. You have been hurt, so aid is given to you in order to balance that out. Justice. It's a basic mathematical equation, really. However, that same equation can be expressed in a negative way. And it's easy to define positive, negative in this case, because positive is adding to it. I am giving to you, I am helping you, I am aiding you, I am helping you, recovering, healing, that kind of a thing, okay? That's justice, as I'm defining it here, okay? Revenge is a negative balancing of the equation. You caused this, therefore this is caused to you. Very simple. In fact, it can be best described by an old phrase, eye for an eye, tooth for a tooth. In other words, you do, thus is done to you. One thing, well, I don't want to get into that. Vengeance is just the desire to hurt someone without any thought of balancing or balancing out the scales or any thought towards long terms. In other words, you hurt me, and I'm going to hurt you, and then I'm going to keep hurting you, and then I'm going to keep hurting you, because screw you. That's vengeance, okay? You can see why I put this on the scale like this. Now, it is worth noting that none of these three specific things are best. I mean, I obviously like to ascribe towards the justice side of things. God, I really don't want to talk about this. But that's why the controversy box is down. But the simple reality is, the thought can be put forward if you do not have a system that invokes revenge, which is what our current system of legality here in the United States is. This is a revenge system, not a justice system. Let's make that 100% clear. By the definitions I just put forth, justice is not served in the courts of the United States. Revenge is. You have done, therefore it is done to you. However, it is my opinion, now that we've moved away from fact, that it's actually vengeance. The vengeance system is actually what we have. Because you are done, therefore much, much worse is done to you. And that is done deliberately, by the way. It's called shock value. Look it up sometime. It's actually a legal term. The whole point is, you accidentally steal something, you lose a month of your life to hell. That is vengeance, not revenge. But I'm getting off topic. But the argument can be leveled that without revenge, there will be more criminals and a worse society, and things will descend into basically total anarchy. The criminals will win, is the general consensus of that argument. And I've heard it many times before. That's a pretty negative outlook on life, I have to admit. There's certainly reasons to think that way. The counter-argument to that is pretty obvious. Criminals still do horrible things. The revenge or vengeance system, whichever you want to call it, does not work because there are still tons and tons of people committing tons and tons of crimes and doing horrible, terrible things, in addition to just normal, everyday style of crimes. The whole gamut is there, and they're still doing these terrible things, despite the fact that punishment is in place, despite the fact that consequence exists. People still do terrible things. So is the system not working? Well, let's be in the interest of balance here, and give another counter-argument to that counter-argument. Those people will commit crimes regardless. They either don't care about consequence, they don't understand consequence, or they're just mentally unbalanced to the point where they're just going to do that kind of thing anyways. Okay? Therefore, the revenge system, or the vengeance system, does not exist for the guilty, it exists for the innocent. One of the most powerful quotes I ever heard with regards to network security was that all the many things we put in place to keep a network stable were there to keep out the innocent. Now, if you don't understand what I mean by that, I can demonstrate a very simple analogy. There's a $5 bill sitting on the ground. It's someone else's. So, you would probably take it, wouldn't you? Now, let's take a step further from that. You see a $5 bill fall out of someone's pocket. You're a little more likely to give that back, but you could still get away with taking it pretty easily. So now there's a smaller percentage of people who would just take the money. Now let's say the $5 is in their pocket, so you have to actually reach in there and take it. And now we have an even smaller group of people who would take the money. Now it's in a safe inside of a bank behind some bars, and you get the point I'm trying to make, I'm sure. Security exists to discourage people who are not criminals. It exists to discourage people who are relatively innocent, who would normally not do that kind of a thing. I'm saying this wrong. Who would normally do that kind of a thing. Who, if there was no checks and no balances and no consequence whatsoever, would just do whatever without regard. Right? Now, if someone is determined to steal, they're going to do it regardless. That's just how that works. That's why there are still crimes being committed, despite consequence being in place, because they're going to do it anyways. Those defenses and those consequences do not matter to them for whatever reason. Again, there's several reasons for that. So the idea is that the vengeance system, or the revenge system, exists to deter the innocent. An innocent man gets thrown behind bars and is traumatized by it to the point where he has to go to 6 months of therapy to recover from it. So, does the system work then? Well, that's a good question. Because here's my counter-argument to my counter-argument to my counter-argument. I like to try and bounce back and forth. I like to try to show as many sides of an argument as I can. I mentioned the money example earlier, right? What does that mean for the person who, even upon seeing the money fall out of someone's pocket, would give it back? Would say, sorry, you dropped this. What does that mean for the truly innocent? The people who, even in absence of consequence, would still do, I'm just going to use the term, good. I was just struggling to come up with another term. I failed. We're just going to summarize. Good. What does that kind of a system do to someone who does not want to cause harm to others? Who does not want to steal? Who does not want to take? Don't tell me there aren't people like that. I know there are people like that. What is the point in a system that does not positively affect people going through it, if not... You get my point. I'm going to cut this off. Point being, these are the three definitions. Now, Garibaldi, we'll get back to the episode here for a moment, is very clearly on the side of revenge. Not vengeance. It is worthy of note. Revenge. Eye for an eye, tooth for a tooth. He killed, he's killed. Bam. Delenn is clearly against that perspective. She does not actually give her own counter-perspective, but her response to that says clearly what she thinks of that. You would have a society where all of us are blind and toothless. It is her perspective that, over enough time, everyone would at some point or another break a tooth or hurt an eye. In other words, that we are all criminals, that there is no such thing as a truly innocent, as I just postulated. Now, this is interesting if you're thinking about it, because you might think Garibaldi's perspective is the cynical one. But it's actually not. It's Delenn's. Garibaldi is the idealist, and his counter-argument says all of that. No, only the bad guys. The fact that Garibaldi thinks that such a thing exists as someone who wouldn't take a tooth or an eye, and therefore would not have to have revenge put upon them, shows his idealism. The fact that Delenn clearly thinks that everyone would do it at some point or another shows her cynicism. Neat, huh? We see this again in a few other places. I'm not going to go over the example. Just watch the episode. Virtually every character interaction shows these two perspectives. But that brings us to the Edward situation. Now, there's not much that justice can do in certain circumstances. I freely and absolutely admit justice doesn't cover everything. It can't. We don't have the tech or the power or the whatever. Okay? If Charlie kills someone, justice, true justice, would be to bring that person back from the dead, to undo and to positively impact. We don't have the tech to do that. So what do? Well, Garibaldi would seek revenge. Life has been taken, so life is taken. The gentleman who became Malcolm would seek vengeance, going way out of their way for 9 years in order to try and brutally punish and beat to death with his bare hands an innocent man. What I want to ask is, does the death of personality come closer to justice than revenge? I, too, will not give judgment on this, just like the episode didn't. I'm actually asking you, do you think the death of personality is more inclined towards revenge, as I have defined it, or justice, as I have defined it? Because something is clearly done. It is clearly not vengeance. In no way is death of personality vengeance. So it's one of the other two. Which one do you think it leans towards? I would argue it's not definitively either, but I'm willing to hear that argument as well. I'd love to hear your thoughts on this. But of course, that brings us to the big sticking point, death of personality itself. This is basically another entire topic, but it is integrally attached to the previous one. So I must discuss it as well. Let's start with the big topic. I really don't want to do this. You would not believe how many comments I got on the episode Believers. I mean, that's good. Topics should be discussed and blah, blah, blah. There's a reason I usually don't discuss this kind of thing, though. Does the soul exist? I'm not actually asking you. I don't care what your answer is. But that is a question that in a fictional setting has to be answered. It must be answered because there are so many things that can affect it. It must be defined for the fictional setting in order for things like this to be properly discussed. So I guess what I'm actually asking you is, in Babylon 5, do you think the soul exists? Why is this relevant? Well, Edward himself brought it up. Is his soul tainted, stained from the original acts? Because it's the same soul, just a different mind. Or Do you define the soul differently? Do you define the soul as the sum of memories? In which case, the original soul doesn't exist anymore. It has been rebuilt into something new. This is why this needs to be discussed. Again, I'm not here to place judgment or to say this is right, but it's something the episode brings up without really hammering in too hard. But it's very, very relevant to the death of personality. Because if the soul exists, how it exists, and what this death of personality does to the person's soul is very, very relevant for discussing death of personality itself. We have to decide, or determine, or enumerate, or something, in order to properly discuss how it affects them long term. Is there an afterlife? Is there a type of thing where they can go on afterwards? Do they carry this forward? Does it affect their new personality? Are they a completely different person? These are the things we need to know. And as I mentioned before, I do personally think droid effect is applicable here. Malcolm seems fairly blank slate. And he's days after his new personality has been created. Edward seemed like a fairly fleshed out, fully versed person. He felt much more human than Malcolm does. And I think that was deliberate. Because remember, Edward has been Edward for 8 years. So even if he was originally basically, a droid, he has since become a person. You with me so far? So is any of Charlie, any of his soul, if you will, any of his original core, affecting who Edward is? Was there always a potential for an Edward in Charlie? Is there a potential for Malcolm in whatever his original name was? These are the things that need to be defined. And I think this is probably the single biggest sticking point about the death of personality and discussing it. Whether it's humane or not, whether it's good or bad, revenge or justice, depends on that definition. And that's why I can't give you a definitive answer. If this is a chance at redemption, if you believe in such things, if there is a soul, a deity or deities, and an afterlife, would not this be a chance at basically giving someone tools they wouldn't otherwise have to redeem themselves, to be forgiven, to be a better person? Hell, that last part doesn't even have to rely on any spiritual side of things. Is this not giving someone the tools to be a better function in society, regardless of any context of soul? Or is this just programming people to be more what we like? Now, this is where things get really tricky. As it is presented in the show, death of personality is like the highest punishment. It's what the death penalty used to be. You do it for the really bad criminals. But they have the tech and ability to destroy your personality and build a new one inside of it. That's horrifying. That's absolutely nightmarish. You think 1984 is bad? Anyone here played Dragon Age Origins? You remember. Oh god, I can't remember his name. Theridon, I want to say. The dwarf who invented the anvil, right? To make golems. Originally, they were all volunteers. Originally, it was to fight the Blight. Years passed. Decades passed. People started being volunteered for it. Criminals started being tossed into there. And then political enemies. And then social unwanteds. It was an A to Z progression. It started out just fine, but over time it got worse by step, by step, by step, by step, until a river of blood flowed through the forge. Is this not the horrible threat that is presented by the mere existence of something like the death of personality? It doesn't matter if you're using it well now. Are you going to use it well in 10 years? In 50? In 1,000? You have to think about these things when you introduce something that has such society-altering ramifications. You can't just say that and say, well, it's fine now. Now only matters partially. Then matters too, as in tomorrow. So I shouldn't say then. Then is usually past. Now and in the future, tomorrow matters as well. You have to think about these kind of things. And it's not hard to see why this could be a problem. Because right now it's only sanctioned groups that have access to it, or at least that's what we believe. How horrible would it be if a criminal organization, or a rogue element, or an alien group, or any number of unpleasant clandestine organizations got a hold of this thing and could just take people and reprogram them. Just bzzz. I can't even begin to express the number of ways that this technology could be abused. That brings me to my point. It's easy for me to look at something and say whether or not I think it should be used with regards to justice, revenge, or vengeance. All I have to do is look at that and say, how else can it be used? To what other extents or ends could it be abused towards? The death penalty, I don't want to talk about this, but the death penalty is a very sticking topic in real-life society right now. It's something that's been argued back and forth. There are good arguments I've heard on both sides, legitimate, actual arguments on both sides, and of course a huge screaming chorus that's just yelling at each other. But the death penalty doesn't introduce something new. It doesn't. It's killing. Killing is one of the oldest inventions. I shouldn't call it that word. Killing is one of the oldest concepts in human history. Might actually be the oldest concept other than living. Killing is not something new. It's not something really society altering, any more than it has been for the last bagrillion years. Let's assume for a moment that all of a sudden we gain the tech right now to do death of personality. That's society changing. Now, the arguments for it are so obvious, I feel stupid for mentioning them. Rather than crowding our prisons or just killing people, we are adding to the substance of our society. New workers, new laborers, people to do some of the more menial work. In other words, we're creating droids for our society. Now that may sound horrible, but that is a definite positive. It's taking something that would have otherwise been a negative or an absence and turning it into a positive. But the counter-arguments are also so obvious that I feel silly for pointing them out. Who's to say what qualifies for that? Who's to say that is ethically correct? To enforce a slave status onto certain types of people. And remember, this is really important, and I've mentioned it like 5 times now, Edward is not Charlie. Why is that relevant? Because this new slave status that you've attached to someone, you're attaching to an innocent. Think about it. Charlie's punishment was to cease to exist. Okay. The new person then has to go and do menial labor and cleaning toilets and generally being a droid as punishment for nothing. Because they didn't do anything wrong, did they? Unless you would argue they did. Unless you'd argue they are the same person. Unless you'd argue their soul is still relevant, or their memories are still present, or they are in some ways considered the same individual, or they deserve it, or the crimes of the father submit to the crimes of the son or the daughter, in the same manner that the crimes of the original personality submit to the crimes of the second personality. These are all points to be made here. The mere fact that there are so many differing perspectives on this technology by itself would make me think that its introduction into real-life society would be a nightmarishly wrong, horrible thing to do. Because there is just so many ways this could go bad. The fact that they have this back home on EarthGov is probably the thing that has horrified me most about the way things are run back on Earth. This is not a joke. Of all the things that have been shown, all the little tidbits we had in Season 2 and some of Season 3, all the little aspects of the Clark administration and Psychor, all of that pales compared to death of personality. The ability to simply rewire someone and say, you're mine now. Do what I say. One of the things that I've often said, my final point, I'll stop talking about this, I swear. One of the things I've often said is that it's easy for me to decide if I believe in a particular form of punishment by asking myself, who would I trust? I'm saying that wrong. Would I trust anyone who is in power to have the ability to do that punishment to me, personally? Do you trust the government of whatever country or state or whatever you live in to have the power to reprogram you and turn you into whatever they want. And again, that's just if it remained in position of the government. Never mind if, like, oh, I don't know, Apple got a hold of that. EA got a hold of that. Could turn employees into the perfect employees. I'm not even hitting the hard targets, which I could. Think about it. I anticipate a lot of comments today. I'm curious of your guys' thoughts. Otherwise, I'll see you next week.